Hello, my name is Ryan Carney, and I'm going to be going over handling exceptions. So, to start off, an exception, some of these things are going to happen when basically just you do something that is outside the rules of um, the basically just Java, and it's going to be things like in our example, I have an array that has three elements in it, and as we all know, an array with three elements can only have an index up to two because it starts counting at zero. So right here, this system.out.println R3, that will cause an exception. And it's actually going to be an array index out of bounds exception. So, I mean, I'll just try it out real quick first. Um, and let's just comment this all out. Cool. So if I run this right now, we're going to see uh, exception, and it has a little message, index three out of bounds for length three. So luckily it does tell you what is wrong. So that's what's really useful about exceptions. Um, but in order to get rid of this problem, and not have your whole program crash, because as you can see here, this system.out.println, the program is finished, did not print because the program just terminates right after the or right when the exception happens if it is not handled correctly. So this is why we have a try catch uh, structure, because basically anything in this little try block right here is what is your code is going to attempt. And if there is an exception, you have to specify what type of exception you want to get caught. But I know that this code right here could possibly produce an array index out of bounds exception, because if I'm doing something outside or with an array, something like that, I know that it possibly could. So if I use this try catch structure, um, if there is an array index out of bounds exception that happens in the try block, then the catch block will catch that array index out of bounds exception, and then you can implement whatever code you want here. So usually if you're going to do it, you have some sort of error message as well, because you also want your user to know that they did cause an exception. So let's go ahead and run this program now, and you should see your array index is out of bounds, and then also see the program is finished because the try catch block makes it so it's not terminated because the exception is caught. So let's see. And yes, perfect. We have your array index is out of bounds and the program is finished. Now, as you guys can see here, I printed out this system.out.println, the program is finished after the fact. Now, if there's an error somewhere in here, then that's not going to happen, as you guys saw. Or if there's an exception, anything like that, that is not caught, then this will not print. However, there's also a format called try catch finally, and basically I'm going to be adding this finally block right here, and whatever is in here is going to print no matter what. So let's say there's a a case where I'm using this and I actually just do it correctly, right? So there's going to be no exception caught, so this will not print out. However, this will. So it's not dependent on this. So if we run it right here, then boom, we can see we printed out the one index in the array, which is just one, and then we also printed out the program is finished. So if you're running this try catch finally block or structure, then whatever is in the try will be attempted. And then if it causes an exception and that exception can be caught by the catch block, then the catch block will execute and the finally block will execute no matter what. So uh, moving on, when we have exceptions, we can also make custom exceptions. So in this one, I just specifically made it's called exception video exception. And in order to make an exception, you just have to have the extends exception. So it is a subclass of the exception class. And all I needed for this was just a couple constructors, because some exceptions are going to come out. And you need some way of having them get constructed. So for ours, I did public exception video exception and then a message you can put in here as a string, because you'll see, as you saw in the last one, when I did the exception for the array index out of bounds, it told us that the index 3 is too large for the array of length 3. So that was the default message that this sends. So I'm going to do the same thing. And this is just a classic no argument constructor for an exception. But we can input our own message here if we want to. So in order to do this, and also show how to throw an exception, I made this method right here. Public static void half an int, and then we have our int a right here. So this is just a really simple method, and it's basically just saying any even number. So if its remainder is not 0, then we have to throw an exception. So any even number fits into this else category, and it'll just print out half of the number is, and then it prints out half of the number. So if it's not, then we're going to throw an exception because we want the user to know that the int isn't even. So we can't just let it slide. But in order to run this, because we have an exception, a possible exception in here, we need to declare it if we're not going to handle it within the actual method. We can use this throws exception video exception and or declaration in the header. And this will basically just allow us to run this. And then hopefully in our next code, it can actually be ran and it's fine. So let's see here. If we just have, if we do half, so as you guys can see here, I use the constructor with a message. So I just saying int isn't even. So let's say I just run half and int 2. And then I'm just going to comment all this out because we don't need it. So as you guys can see, we have an unhandled exception type of exception video exception. So because this can throw an exception, which we needed to declare in this header, because basically this method header or the in the declaration of the method is basically just telling the compiler that this can throw an exception and it'll be passed up to wherever it's being implemented. So right here, it's in the main method. And we still have to use a try catch structure right here. So let's say I do this and then I do catch. And then as you can see, the only one that can be thrown in here is the exception video exception. So I'm going to put exception video exception E, and then I'm just going to put sorry, because sorry, I can't divide your number by 2. Perfect. All right. So as you can see here, if the method throws or if the method, or if A is not even, then it will throw an exception video exception that has the message int isn't even. Then, because we declared it, it allowed to run. We try it down here because it still has the possibility of throwing an exception. And then here we also use our try catch structure. But because this is an even number, it should just work out fine. So let's try it. And perfect. We have half of 2 is 1. But now let's say we do 1. Then it should be saying sorry because we threw our exception up here. So as you guys can see, it did not run properly. It threw our exception video exception and it ran, or it also said sorry. So let's say we wanted to just see what the exception message will look like. If we just run half and int, and then we do 1, but we specify here that it throws an exception video exception. This will not handle the exception. It is more just kind of dodging the exception, but it still will not allow our code to properly run. So as you can see here, yes, we have our exception in thread main, and it says int isn't even, which is exactly what we expected. Now, there is 2 types of exceptions. First, there is the checked exception, which is this. So basically, because exception video exception extends the exception class and all of its subclasses are of they are checked exceptions, which basically means that before the program even compiles, the JVM or the compiler checks to see if there is any checked or if all the checked exceptions are dodged or handled. So if we don't have this right here, we are going to see the error pop up right here. Yes, and it says unhandled exception type exception video exception. Now, if you have an unchecked exception, that's a different story. The class runtime exception is a unchecked exception, and all of its subclasses are going to also be unchecked exceptions. So this is not saying that they won't cause exceptions, but we don't need to tell our program that it could throw it. We don't need to put the throws declaration right here. So let's say I just put runtime exception. You see here, now we don't have an error because it's unchecked exception. So we're actually allowed to do that without having to do the throws. Now, it still is going to produce an exception, but it's still going to allow us to compile without having to deal with it at all. And that is really all I have for the exception videos. I hope you guys learned something. Thank you. Bye-bye.